All right, my name is Ziska Putz. I'm a graduate researcher at the University of Oxford in England, and I have the pleasure of speaking with Lane Rasberry today about the value of Wikipedia for healthcare content and healthcare organizations. And my research specifically looks at the role of global burden of disease study, specifically the controversial one, which was published in 2010. So I hope that Lane can guide me through how this issue was represented on Wikipedia.
How do you do? My name is Lane Rasberry. I'm Wikimedian in residence at the School of Data Science at the University of Virginia. I've been editing Wikipedia's health content almost every day since about 2008. I'm a member of various Wiki community organizations, including Wikimedia Medicine. I participate in on-Wiki organizations such as they are. I'm also a member of Wikimedia New York City, the local Wikipedia chapter for that region, and happy to talk about anything to do with Wikipedia, its health information, or its community. Thanks for meeting with me.
Thank you. To kick us off, then, I'm sure this is a question you've answered many, many times, but how did you get into editing Wiki in the first place, and specifically WikiMed content?
It was a few things. So before I was editing Wikipedia, I was an undergraduate in the mid-2000s, and I was interested in the idea of sharing more information online. As a teenager, I had a website and I was posting different things there, and I was trying to understand how do people get their information. I started putting my class notes from my university classes on my own website, and then I looked to see how can I considered, should I drive more traffic to my website? I quickly decided, no, that's not the way. And I was looking to see where are people going for information. I tried to contribute to other kind of encyclopedic projects, and I found Wikipedia. I edited it for the first time in 2004 while I was in university. And it didn't stick with me at that time. I had an on again, off again relationship with Wikipedia for a few years. And then I got a job in clinical research at my university. And they said, you should share information about this clinical research in Wikipedia, or not in Wikipedia, in the internet. And I had remembered what I had done with Wikipedia. And I thought, okay, I'm going to do a pilot. I'm going to put some of this information inside Wikipedia and then try to find out how many people are reading it there. It stuck with me and I liked it. And so I've been editing ever since. I feel like Wikipedia is an extremely popular source of information, and people who are trying to share information to the largest audience possible, and they want that audience to be relevant, people who are actually looking for it, I feel they should consider putting their information in Wikipedia, because that's what people find when they're searching for information online.
What do you love about it?
I like its community ethics, this idea of free and open media that anyone can use. I like the accessibility of it. So if I have a health text and I want to adapt it or update it, I don't need permission from a lawyer, which is what I would need if I tried to collaborate with a healthcare institution. I like the idea that it can be an accessible language, because a lot of times healthcare experts, they may be an authority on what's the most precise kind of healthcare information they need for somebody in their field. But actually that level of precision may not be required with to educate the public about a given topic. And so we can work with yet other healthcare organizations and health experts to provide the information at a certain level of accessibility that makes it right to share with the audience we're trying to reach. Also, I'm interested in translation of information, and a lot of organizations that are very, very generous to provide healthcare materials, they just are trapped within their geographic region, and they imagine that no one outside of their geographic region is part of their outreach demographic. But in Wikipedia, we have efforts to try to translate all the information we have into every language to make it accessible everywhere in the world. English is tremendously privileged on the internet. The majority of good information that anyone can find is in English language, but English is not the majority language of the world. And even if it was, we still need to provide for the minority languages. So I like that Wikipedia thinks of that. I also like Wikipedia's community governance, the idea that there's not corporate actors running around telling everybody what to do and how things should be done. We operate with a community grassroots hierarchy, where when we need consensus or need a leadership, we appoint a leader ad hoc, usually to facilitate a conversation. And that rank is not persistent. So they perform a leadership role. A person's designated to perform a leadership role. They do it per project. And then other than that, it's peer-to-peer with a lot of equality. It's a very anarchist philosophy for managing things. And I appreciate that. And I think it's appropriate for a global project like Wikipedia, where you really need hundreds of thousands of contributors.
From your experience, when it comes to the peer-to-peer production of Wikipedia content, are there any unique challenges that are specific to WikiMed projects that might be different from topics related to history or perhaps different content?
We could talk about that, and I'll talk about it briefly, but I'll say that most people would be surprised about the unique challenges of publishing in Wikipedia at all. So
Okay.
it's an unfamiliar space. So if I were to talk about what's different about Wiki Project Medicine, that would be in comparison to Wikipedia. And Wikipedia is unlike anything else. So for one thing, anybody can edit Wikipedia. Many people have heard this. It's been the Wikipedia advertising marketing tagline for many years, Wikipedia, the encyclopedia that anyone can edit. And what this means is that anyone can come off the street. They don't even need to register an account. No one knows what they're doing, who they are, and they can edit a Wikipedia article that's getting hundreds of thousands of people visiting it in short periods of time. So for example, we're in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic right now, and anybody can edit these COVID-19 articles. We don't vet who they are. There's no pre-publication review. We can make up new publishing concepts, and we do. Post-publication review, how do you like that? Can you imagine if print newspapers ever had post-publication review? Of course not. Any standard publication, you review it before it gets published. And in Wikipedia, we have these, since it's a digitally native platform, if somebody edits something, it's not that it's just chaos and that anyone can do what they want. It just means that immediately they're editing publication. It's actually publication. It's not a suggestion, but we vet it through people who are going to fact check it after the fact. And if they don't like it, then they'll just revert it. So we invite anyone to participate in this way because that's the way that we found that gets the most community participation, conversation, debate, establishes the discourse. If somebody does something, then we can talk it through. Why did you do this? Let's do it another way. Whereas if we said, you can submit this and maybe we'll publish it in a few weeks, people just wouldn't be so quick to even give their submission. Okay. There's a lot more that I could say about Wikipedia's publication process, but your specific question is what's different about Wiki Project Medicine? The most striking thing is that it's one of the most developed wiki projects in Wikipedia. Now, a wiki project is a community organization that's interested in doing one particular sort of task in Wikipedia. There's two kinds of Wikipedia editors and two kinds of wiki projects. You can divide Wikipedia in two ways: administration and subject matter content, subject matter expertise. So there's a wiki project for some of the more popular wiki projects. I'll just list them. Military history, extremely popular because everyone from every country can participate in that. Medicine is super popular. Video games, LGBT, gay issues, mathematics, and transportation. So there's a lot of people who are interested in the highways, the trains, big boats, big vehicles of all kinds. So transportation. So those are some of the most popular wiki projects. But if I just tell you there's a community project in Wikipedia, and we call these wiki projects, and we have some people who are doing content and some people who are copy editing or managing disputes. Those are other kinds of community organizations or wiki projects. You might think that this is something like a social media group in Facebook or maybe a website like Reddit, where you have this large number of people in this process and they're sorting things out in different ways. The big difference in Wikipedia, and this is hard for an outsider to see, is that even the people who participate in these groups are frequently not regulars. So in Wiki Project Medicine, say 95% plus of the medical content that comes into that project, it's by people who may not even know the Wiki project exists. So if anybody's editing medical content, then somehow people in Wiki Project Medicine are vetting it. But people in Wiki Project Medicine, they're not really the content creators. That's one thing. Another thing is, like I said, Wikipedia has this anarchist philosophy without leadership. So even if someone in Wiki Project Medicine reviews something and they decide that there's a conflict or a dispute, like I disagree with this source, I don't think this source is reliable, or I think you're incorrectly interpreting the source. The people in Wiki Project Medicine may not be the people to process that. They may kick that to yet another community organization, be it a Wiki project or something else, who would do something like um, check the quality of the source, review this academic journal to see its legitimacy, or this is an organization in such and such a country. We need to show this to people who are in the wiki project for that country, and they need to review it. So a great deal of the activity in Wiki Project Medicine has nothing to do with medicine, and that's the same as with all these other wiki projects. And if you're not a part of this community, if you're not seeing the ball move from agent to agent, everyone's doing their own part in a production queue, then it may seem that the wiki project is a monolith, or many people perceive Wikipedia to be run by paid staff. This must be paid staff running every step of the way, or they just assume that there's some kind of leadership in place and they say, take me to the leader. And that question doesn't apply for this kind of circumstance. There is no leader. It's a lot of people who are doing one particular thing that they're very good at, and passing these kind of suggestions on and on. So yes, I do think it's important for people to understand that there's a Wiki Project Medicine, and yes, it has rules and people follow the rules. Another thing interesting about Wiki Project Medicine or any other wiki project is the precision of the outcomes. We don't have academic research that demonstrates this. It's kind of hard to prove, and we haven't been able to put it together themselves, but just anecdotally, the feeling that the community has is if somebody takes a situation and they drop it into a wiki project, and somebody else were to take that same situation or a comparable situation and drop it into the wiki project another time or in other circumstances, they would be judged in the exact same way. That's what I mean by precision. So it doesn't matter how someone brings the case, or it doesn't matter how erudite they are in making their case, or when it happens, or who processes it, or if someone's a member of Wiki Project Medicine, or if they're not, the cases will get processed in the same way through this wiki community infrastructure. It's very robust, and I would say trust in that infrastructure is one of the reasons why people have trust in Wikipedia if they're a Wikipedia editor.
Thank you. I want to come back to the unique qualities of Wikipedia's infrastructure that you're saying does such a great job in regulating the content that ends up being produced.
Yeah.
But first, you
Sure.
made a really interesting comment in a 2016 publication for a Wikimania conference that I'd love for you to expand on.
Sure.
So you said, despite Wikipedia's extreme popularity as a health information source, and despite the research already done, much basic research on this content has not yet been done. The lack of that research is a contributing factor in harm to Wikipedia's reputation, and harmed reputation is increasingly becoming a barrier to establishing institutional partnerships with medical organizations.
Yes,
Can you talk me through what you meant with harmed reputation and the lack of research impacting that?
All right. Wikipedia is a nonprofit project. We have different values and these ethical principles that we follow. We have a philosophy. If I were to explain the philosophy in the terms of its own community in the briefest way, I would say that Wikipedia is a participant in the open movement. And just about everybody who's editing Wikipedia, we also believe in this open movement. In the sciences, people have heard of open access. There's things like open copyright, open media, open governance, open, you put the word open in front of everything and it means something. And collectively, this is the open movement. So in Wikipedia, our content strives to be open. One of the ways that we're open, that other organizations have challenges being open, is we're open about our user metrics. For any Wikipedia article on any day in any language, we allow anyone, even without registering an account or having special permission, to collect the communication metrics, the readership metrics, the page views for how many people have read, how many users have accessed. Excuse me, could be one user going multiple times. There's a definition of page view, but how many requests there have been for a particular Wikipedia article. So what someone can do is you could take the totality of medicine, every Wikipedia article in medicine, Or you could just say, I care about cardiology, I care about women's health, I care about global infectious disease, whatever you like, and just look at that traffic. And we've been publishing these traffic reports for a long time. And what would be ideal is that the leading health communication organizations in the world would put their traffic statistics on the table. What's your total reach for how many people you're reaching? And then we make a comparison with Wikipedia. So we've got different ways. There's different services which give you web metrics for different websites. And you can get these. I'm not going to name any brand names, but anyone in online media knows how to get these estimates from different websites about how many people are going there. But they could be more precise because, for example, there's a lot of traffic that goes to a landing page on a website, but that's not actually people reading the health information. Whereas Wikipedia, people don't really navigate from the landing page into the encyclopedia. If they do, we don't track it in that way. We can track for a very specific drug, a disease, a medical condition, a therapy, a social issue in medicine, a health organization. We can tell you exactly how many people are reading this information. And that's kind of we consider this to be a proxy for how many people are searching for this content period, because the Wikipedia articles are frequently what people find in response to a search. That is, if somebody just used an internet search engine, or increasingly a virtual assistant, they just ask their phone, show me such and such, then they're being directed to Wikipedia articles. And I feel like Wikipedia would get a lot more respect if there was a serious conversation about its place in the media environment. I think, based on these traffic metrics and the best data that I have from elsewhere, and many other Wikipedia editors feel that Wikipedia is the most requested, published, accessed, and consulted source of health information in the world. And if that's the case, then there's a certain amount of communication or media investment that Wikipedia merits. I do see a lot of organizations investing in things like their own websites, and their communication strategy is to pay for advertising or conduct the kind of marketing that drives traffic to their website. And in my view, things like investing in website, trying to be popular in social media, trying to hire a spokesman, flying people out around the world to speak it from their mouths into the ears of people rather than using the scalability of digital media, I think these things are very expensive. And yet, if anyone were to apply for funding and they said, I'm going to build a website, I'm going to pay for marketing to drive traffic there, I'm going to fly around and preach global health media, and then they would get funding. Whereas if somebody said, I'm going to put my stuff on Wikipedia, I know what happens when people say that. I get laughed out of the room. And I would like someone to have a peer-to-peer conversation, someone to recognize Wikipedia as a peer, say, I'm in health media and health communication, and I see Wikipedia is doing the same thing. What can Wikipedia do to help us achieve distribution and dissemination? And Wikipedia has the converse problem. So this is the shame of it all. In the internet, everyone's striving for popularity, and people who used to say, I'm in academic publication, if you want attention in an academic publication, you have to go into, say, Twitter or into the media ecosystem, and you have to compete with teenagers, frankly. And you're competing for eyeball time. And it doesn't matter who you are, everyone's distracted by something or other on the internet. And you might think that you're publishing in scholarly health media, but the entirety of the media ecosystem is a distraction from what you're trying to do. And a lot of health organizations might say, our main competitor, we're a health organization, our main competitor are these other health organizations or these other people. And that's not the case at all. Your main competitor is social media, and everybody's competitor in the media ecosystem is social media. And I wish that these organizations with expertise, they would quit trying to play the media distribution and marketing game, because they're never going to win. And they would say, instead of doing that, we're just going to make our content as accessible as possible for distribution in the channels that already exist. And if they would just make their expertise available, we would distribute it through Wikipedia, cite them, give them credit. Of course, we give credit. And through Wikipedia, they would reach heights that would never be possible on any budget that they could conceivably have. And Wikipedia is giving them credit. And also Wikipedia, it never purports to replace them. Of course, it's citing them as the authority, and Wikipedia doesn't develop a truth. It doesn't say we do research. It just says we're trying to present you with the best in the world. And to be cited in Wikipedia, that should be a mark of excellence. That means you've done something worth distributing globally, worth translating, worth remixing, worth putting in the hands of students. Because when students or journalists or policymakers are trying to get oriented to a topic, they'll start with Wikipedia. And I wish that organizations, if they were cited in Wikipedia, they thought that was respectable. But that's just not part of the culture nowadays. It's just, we're not there yet.
Well, let's dig into some of that with a really specific case study. Can you talk me through, before we begin, how you came to work on the Institute of Health Metric and Evaluations page in 2011?
Sure. I'm at an organization called the University of Virginia nowadays. In 2011, I was living in Seattle, Washington. I graduated from the University of Washington, and the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation was part of a circuit of health organizations in Seattle that would host Science for the Public talks. And I used to hang out socially at that organization. There were some other organizations that would host these kind of talks. They would give you snacks and give you something nice to drink.
All the student essentials.
Yes. And they would have a scientist talk about something, and it would be a community conversation. It would be students, it would be professionals, it would be people who were neither student nor professional, but who cared about these kind of things. They were pretty open. And at the time in Seattle, there was a circuit of these things. So one organization would host one, you go to their place, and then another organization would host one, and they all cross-promoted each other. And they had built up a health community. And these weren't healthcare practitioners that were there, but the point of it was community conversations about health, and often they would talk about the ethics of things. Try to make it more accessible. What is the place of us in Seattle, in this well-off city? It's a very comfortable life there. What is our place in the global health environment? What is global health, and what does it mean for us to have this kind of privilege, and how can we change the world? So Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation, they were doing some odd things. They were more metrics oriented as compared to a lot of the other talks. And at the time I wasn't getting it. I listened to their talks and I thought, don't we already have this data? Why do we need more? What processing data? You just look at it and it's evident. I wasn't getting it at the time, but I remember asking these questions in hindsight, and it was a fun organization. I went there. 2011, you know what they did? They hosted my first Wikipedia talk ever. I pitched them and I begged, and I went to all their meetings and I said, I want to talk about Wikipedia. I want to talk about health information on Wikipedia. Will you host me? They hosted my talk. That was the first place I ever gave a Wikipedia presentation. They were very generous. I didn't know what I was doing. I did my best, and everyone was very nice to listen to me for an hour. I was a guest speaker, yes. And so I edited. Cool. Yeah, so I edited a bit about the organization. I edited about the people, not just that organization. I was editing about all the health organizations that were participating in this circuit. That was something I was doing on Wikipedia. I was editing about clinical trials that were being talked about in Seattle, or someone would talk about one in the lecture. I took photographs of the different people of this organizations, and I tried to make profiles of them to say, who's making these decisions? Who's a part of my community? Who's the ones who will actually go and talk with people who walk up off the street and don't know anything about health? I know you've got a PhD. I know you've been working in your field for 20 years. I know you're really expected, but will you really talk with a weirdo off the street if they have a question? And if someone would do that, I would be much more inclined to volunteer to make a Wikipedia article for them. The director of the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation was one of those people. I developed his Wikipedia article as well.
Chris Murray's?
Yes, I took his picture. I took his photo that's on Wikipedia. It's been there for 10 years. He should give me a higher quality picture. Our technology's changed since then.
Yeah, at this point, he definitely should. He's been in the news quite a bit for the COVID predictions, for better or worse. Well, you weren't the only person editing this page. So in 2011, you flagged some problematic edits that another editor had done. And you explained that some of the content you added, which was mainly about the staff and funding, is problematic for lack of referencing and some other issues. A user find it, the user's page here, and there was apparently a conflict of interest as well. So can you explain what some of those other issues were that you had referenced, and also why you thought there was a conflict of interest?
All right. I'm just going to put this entire thing in a box. I'm going to explain it, and I could talk through it point by point. There's two ways of discussing this. So an organization comes into Wikipedia, they start editing Wikipedia, and inevitably the Wikipedia community starts sending them warning messages. Don't do this, go here, do this, trying to put them in the production queue, and the organization's unhappy. This is a big part of why Wikipedia has a poor reputation. It's because organizations are unable to engage with Wikipedia in the way that they're able to engage with other media platforms. Organizations are looking for the leader. Who's the person I can talk to get this done? How do I pay a consultant? How do I pay Wikipedia? How do I get my way in Wikipedia? So this happens routinely on the scale of millions, And I've managed thousands of these conversations, and the success rate for organizations is approximately zero. I can't think of, if it's not zero, then I can't think of a good example. Like somebody may have barely straggled through and found some minimal success, but there's almost no success stories, and there's no success stories celebrated by the Wikipedia community of a good institutional collaboration. And again, this starts because of lack of respect. So two things are going on. The shorthand of it is we say that organizations shouldn't edit about themselves. People shouldn't edit about themselves. We call this conflict of interest, and that's where we begin the conversation. Actually, that's not the conversation we want to have. Actually, conflict of interest isn't a problem at all. The problem is that we have rules in Wikipedia. We have quality standards. There's certain things that people are supposed to do, and there has never been one instance of an organization that was willing to abide by the rules. If only an organization would abide by the rules, there wouldn't be a problem. So for example, in Wikipedia, we do this vetting of what's quality information and what's inappropriate information. And organizations typically, and this is so unfortunate, when organizations come to Wikipedia, what they see in Wikipedia is an opportunity to talk about the infrastructure of their organization. The least important part of the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, or any other organization, is the administrative structure of the organization itself. What the public really wants from that organization and other health organizations is their expertise about health. So when this organization comes to Wikipedia, they didn't want to talk about health, which is their expertise. They don't want to talk about their expertise. They want to talk about themselves. And not only do they want to talk about themselves, they don't want themselves presented through the eye of a journalist or third-party research. There shouldn't be any peer review of the organization. What they really want to share is their own marketing materials. Just as a shorthand, this isn't always the case. There's exceptions to this, but we have different levels of review. There's different quality processes in Wikipedia. And in articles about organizations or articles about people, what we say is you should cite sources that talk about this, feature this as the subject, but aren't authored by that. That is, if someone authors an article about themselves and publishes them on their blog, we don't cite that in Wikipedia. If an organization has an about page where they present their public face, then that's out of bounds for Wikipedia. If an organization has been the subject of independent journalism, then that's what we cite. And you might be surprised at the number of organizations that go through a budget of $100 million a year and that doesn't result in a single piece of organic journalism for them. So they get really upset if they come to Wikipedia and we say, cite the journalism, and they say, we've been spending billions of dollars. No one's ever written about us. Therefore, we have a right to put our marketing materials in Wikipedia. And we just say no. I don't know how to make the connection. I don't know how organizations with big relationships with public relations firms and media departments haven't been able to look at the last 20 years of Wikipedia and said this, okay, so it failed 100,000 times this year and 1,000,000 times that year. And it may have failed many millions of times, but we're going to do the same thing and we're going to have a different outcome. That's right. The relationship that organizations have with Wikipedia.
So for this case specifically, was it an issue that they were sharing so much administrative content, which was of interest?
They were citing their own website. They were citing their own website. They were citing their own self-published materials.
And you know that the editor was part of I2Me?
I would have to look at this particular case, but if I remember correctly, their username was user IMHE. IHME.
Okay.
There was a connected contributor, and we have ways of connecting people to organizations. I think they self-profess this, and it's just there's only one kind of person that's going to go to a Wikipedia site and say, you know what I'm going to do with this? You know what would make this better? Some administrative metrics. That's what this article needs. There's only one kind of person who does this. It's never the teenager who's a fan of the organization. It's never the college student. It's only the person who's been ordered to do that by typically the executive of the organization or someone in senior management.
Got it. There was also a very small edit that you made, a revision where somebody had added detail about funding that IHME received from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is their core funder, but also a ton of smaller ones.
Yep. And
you had asked them to remove the smaller ones and cited that it wasn't relevant. Can you explain why content like that wouldn't be relevant to include on their wiki?
I have to look at it. Of course, this is years ago, but if I had to guess, I would say lack of citation, lack of third-party citation. So a donation, a funder only becomes significant in Wikipedia's eyes if that funding gets recognition from a third-party participant. So okay. If a large funder gives money to an organization, and then the large funder puts out a press release and the small funder puts out a press release, Wikipedia disregards both of those. However, if a journalist in the community comments on the donation, then we'll cite the journalist. We don't want to hear from the funder. We don't want to hear from the organization. We want to hear from somebody who's not paid to be involved in this.
Got it. What does it take for the warning tag that you had put on the page to be removed?
Consciousness, like a sense of self-awareness, like somebody saying, okay, I get what's happening here, and I understand that Wikipedia has rules, and I understand that we didn't comply with them, and I understand that you're volunteers giving your time, and I'm paid to argue with you volunteers. So I know you volunteers are trying to improve health information, and I'm a corporate shill and I'm being paid to argue with you. I promise not to shill anymore, and I'm going to start acting like a decent human being and not harass volunteers anymore. And I'm going to do something appropriate with my life. It doesn't have to be like that, but there's just so many people who are paid to argue and try to tear down the wiki community and act like we're the first person. This is the only time that wiki's ever criticized an organization for doing self-promotion. That's most people's perspective when they come to this, as if it hasn't been the same for 20 years. I edited Wikipedia for the first time in 2004. As soon as I edited, I was promoting a particular chocolate factory in Seattle, and my edits immediately got kicked out because I'm a big fan of this chocolate. So I know the system was in place in 2004, and my edits got kicked out within an hour after I did this. And it was like that long before 2004, and it's been the same ever since. Nothing's changed here. These are volunteers who are trying to share knowledge, and we're not here to curate anyone's advertising or marketing platform. That's not what the volunteers want to do. And we'd like for people to engage in Wikipedia in their field of expertise. And a health organization is more than its administrative structure. It actually puts out a lot of good content, and we'd love to engage with them on the content. And there is a place for administration in the Wikipedia articles. We've got a set of rules. They're available for anyone to read if anyone cares. And so if somebody wants the warning message taken down, a good thing to say is, okay, here's the link to the rules. I've read them, and I'm going to comply with them now. So that's the one sentence way to do it. But the internalization of it is the recognition of the difference between marketing and education for public benefit. There's a lot of organizations that act as if there's no difference between the things. That is, they're doing a benefit by saying who their C-level staff are, and
Right.
nobody wants that.
Well, another related page is that of the Global Burden of Disease Study, which of course is one of the hallmark products that
Yes.
IHB now works on with WHO.
Yeah.
You posted a really interesting comment in about a year ago where you said, I'm concerned about the undue influence. This wasn't pertaining to the history section.
Yeah.
This study is disproportionately influential on policy making for what it is. It is a great study, but it appears everywhere, and the paper itself needs interpretation.
Mhm.
This history is from one of the contributors. Already this history is 15 years old. If there's more history, interviews, or journalism on the study itself, then someone please share. What are you getting at there?
This study, the Global Burden of Disease study, it's fundamental for the understanding of global health. What this study is, different people could explain it in different ways, but they attempt to scrape up the health metrics from every source in the entire world. And some things are better represented in this study and some aren't, but they're trying to count how many people have every disease in the world. Where are these people? How long did they have this disease? How did the disease affect them? How is the disease treated? And what is the cost to humanity in terms of days of people's lives, healthy days of people's lives, in the terms of the money that governments invest, in the terms of disruption to economies? What does it mean to have diseases? And the goal of this paper and the goal of global health is to identify what's the most severe disease affecting the most people, causing the most trouble, that can be treated and eliminated or prevented with the least resources. That is, if you can spend a little amount of money and solve the biggest problems, then we as a global society, this is what we should concentrate on. How do you get the most global impact? Because one soul is the same as another, one human is the same as another. We should be eliminating suffering and disease indiscriminately. If you can spend money to relieve suffering anywhere in the world, then that's what we as humans and humanity should be doing. So if there's a Wikipedia article about a country, all these countries in the world, or a region in a country, or several countries, a geographic region. So India is a country, and then maybe you care about South Asia as a whole, the entire region. There's Wikipedia articles about India, and it's got some kind of section about demographics and healthcare, because that's how Wikipedia is. It's general reference information. And I'm talking about the main article that talks about the geography, the population, the culture, the arts, and then health is a part of every society. And then if you want to go deeper into that paragraph in the main article, there's an article about the health of every country, a specific article just to talk about the health issues of every country in the world. The Global Burden of Disease study, because of its depth of coverage, because of how long it's been around, because of its general applicability to big issues in human society, this is a study that we could represent in every Wikipedia article on every country and every super region. Not only that, it's a study that we could cite in every article about a disease that it's covering. This is an art, and it's not just about that in English. It's about translating it into other languages in the world. This is a candidate for what could be the most important study in terms of health in human history, because this is the information that takes the health information that the public needs for politics, for understanding your society, for understanding your neighbors in your community. What are you dealing with? For understanding the future of humanity, where are we going? We need some base data to find out how many people in my community have such and such a disease. What other communities in the world have this kind of health problem that they're dealing with? How did other organizations solve this? How did other communities and countries solve this? And who's at different places in the timeline? So if we're rolling out vaccination programs, if you see that there was a time when many countries had this burden, and then some people did health programs and they got rid of their burden, but other people did other health programs and they still have it. In what ways can we take lessons learned and use that to effectively solve health problems everywhere, instead of haphazardly just coming up with health programs that aren't transparent, aren't open, don't have this open philosophy, and just may come out of an executive's head, may come out of a senior politician or senior public health official's head, but aren't really evidence-based or data-based? Can we get more evidence into community discussion about what all this means? But it's so hard to get access to the global burden of disease study, because it's not as if this is just a single report that somebody can read. It's a lot of databases. The data is of varying quality from different places. It's published as many papers. And the study itself, it's an interactive database that people can query and get different kinds of insights from. And that's not what most people think of when they're thinking about a cited source. And Wikipedia itself, we don't cite databases in Wikipedia. We say that if we're going to be citing information, we need an interpretation. And we say the reason, it's not that we don't think databases are reliable, it's just that databases need interpretation. You can't put data out and say, this is self-evident, we should just report it and people will know what it means. If you say that a certain percentage of people have a disease, you need to put that in some kind of social context. Like, is that a lot? Is that a little? Is this a big deal? Was there something else going on? You can't just drop numbers into the Wikipedia article and say, okay, we've educated the public. We need some kind of interpretation. And so there's a challenge in taking the information and knowledge from the global burden of disease study, translating it into Wikipedia, but it's absolutely essential. If we don't do it for this study, we've got to do it for something that's pretty darn close to this study, because we need this information in so many Wikipedia articles. And it's a citizen's right to have access to information about what kind of health issues are happening in your community. What is your government spending money on? What are we doing as a society to make our communities a better place and grow and give people higher quality of life? Everyone needs some access to public health information and global health information. And we could be getting it from this study, but it's problematic for mostly cultural reasons.
And when you say cultural, you mean Wikipedia's culture?
No, the health organization's culture, because they don't make this accessible. They assume that their audience is people who are doing health demography, and that's right. Not the audience. This is much bigger than that. We need this translated to be accessible. There's a big thing that health organizations do is they don't use free and open media. They assert copyright on all their research papers. And so people can't even read it.
Yep.
Research papers, we can't expect, if somebody wants to read a paper about the global burden of disease in the developing country, and you want them to pay $35 in American dollars for access to the paper?
Well, I to me push back on that. They say we have all kinds of fancy open access visualizations and tools that you can play with, and tutorials for you to learn how to use those tools. So actually all this information is publicly available.
We need copyright permission for the visualization. So even illustrations, they can have copyright. We have efforts in Wikipedia, if there's open access journals like PLOS that go through the entirety of PLOS, rip out their data visualizations, mirror them in Wikipedia, note the copyright, and then we can start reusing those in Wikipedia. But if there's other organizations that aren't making these accessible, what they're expecting us to do is they'll say, okay, you can read this, but you need to redraw your own diagram, and you need to do this at scale for every diagram that's ever been written. Like, why?
You don't want to do that?
What? No,
you don't want to do
that. And the authors of the paper don't want that either. It's an error. Of course they want people to read their paper. It's about the publishers. It's about the inertia. We're still publishing in a paper scheme, imagining that there's not going to be any reuse of this stuff. But if someone has an interesting data visualization or diagram, that's an illustration that we want to put in Wikipedia. And they need to license it for remixing, because it's not just about making this diagram available in English. We have to translate the terms. And if it's not a diagram that's set up to be published at scale, we need to convert the file format and change the language. And maybe we only need part of it for a country. Maybe they're showing different regions, and we need to remix it. We need the right to remix. That should be the default in global health. The free and open access to all the text. In Wikipedia, we don't, even if we can read the text, it would be ideal if we could just copy and paste portions of papers, drop that directly into Wikipedia without rewriting the words. There's so many authors, they do put so much effort into copy editing their papers and word crafting it, and then they assert a copyright on it. So when we represent that paper in Wikipedia, we've got to rewrite it in our own words. So all that precision just goes out the window. Their papers, when they get represented in Wikipedia, we have to respect this author's life plus 70 years copyright term that they've claimed on this. And so what are we supposed to think? I guess all these diseases aren't really the most important thing in the world. Isn't these diseases? The most important thing in the world is copyright, because obviously you don't want anyone to get your health information until 70 years after you die. Like, what is this? What kind of public health educator says, I don't want anyone to read my work until 70 years after I'm dead? But in fact, so many of them do this.
I know we're coming up on time, but
Sure.
do you have a hard stop, or can you go over by 10 minutes?
I can go over. Let's keep talking.
Thank you. Okay, I have something I really want to get to, which is the reception of this report. You said it's a citizen's right to know what kind of diseases are going on in your area and how officials in positions of power, what they're doing to address them.
Mhm.
It's also a citizen's right to know how credible that information is in the first place. And the GBD 2010 specifically, which was the first burden of disease study that IHME worked on, received a lot of pushback from other academics who are working in epidemiology and health demographics. Mm-hmm. And we have 2 pages that are covering this topic, with the IHME's page and the Global Burden of Disease study page. Mm-hmm. Both of them have a subject for reception of the report. Mm-hmm. Now, in the GBD study page, this is 2 sentences. Mm-hmm. On the IHME's page, it's very long and detailed. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to get your thoughts on this. First of all, why do you think there's more information on the IHME's page in this section? And second of all, in the section on the GBD study page, that's only 2 sentences. One of those sentences essentially has a bunch of links to the New York Times articles, The Guardian, these kind of very common mainstream news media outlets, proving that they're citing the study. Why is that valuable?
It's not. There's almost no value in any of this. And the reason why it's there is somebody cared enough to post it there. So if somebody sees an article in the New York Times and they see an organization that they're unfamiliar with, then they're likely to take that article from New York Times and just drop it and put their best summary in the Wikipedia article for someone to copy edit later. But overall, the reason why this doesn't matter is there's not a significant, the audience who's reading the article on the organization itself is insignificant. Mm-hmm. So that readership really doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. And the audience that is reading about the global burden of disease, much more important than the organization itself, but it's still insignificant when you compare that to the audience of people who are reading about the health information, the diseases that are actually in the study. So when you have an organization, or you have the product of an organization, which is what this study is, yep, there's not a fan community behind this. It's a lot of people who are haphazardly collecting sources and dropping them in Wikipedia when they see them, maybe summarizing it in their own words with a sentence or 2. But we don't have a community that's ready to just copy edit this and make it flow and fairly represent the organization, because there's no traffic to these articles. People aren't coming to Wikipedia to read these. The only people, so this very insignificant demographic coming to read these articles are just the funders. Like, that's the only people who care. And of course, this is absolutely critical to the organization itself. Yes, researchers, like a few researchers, but not the, not the public. I know organizations the Wikipedia article makes or breaks whether an organization is going to get funding, because if you submit a long, complicated health proposal or a research proposal of any kind, and the funding reviewer, the potential sponsor, has never heard of your organization, of course they're going to check you out on Wikipedia if you don't have a prior relationship. So in that sense, these kind of things are absolutely critical for the revenue stream for the organization. And I want organizations to have a good relationship with Wikipedia. It's not that I don't want them fairly represented in Wikipedia. It's just that there's no one in Wikipedia who cares about this, because from Wikipedia's perspective, the point of the organization, the article on the organization, is to help people put in context the cited sources that are being summarized in Wikipedia articles that say that this organization was the author, this organization was the publisher. So there's these links. And if someone were to cite a global burden of disease paper in a Wikipedia article about a health issue, and it says it comes from this organization, and they say, well, I've never heard of that organization. Who are they? Some of the things they're going to want to know is, are they non-evidence-based medicine? Are they cranks? Are they doing alternative medicine? Are they reputable? Do they have research collaborations? Some of the things they'd want to know is, how big is the organization? Is it just one guy? Is it just one person who's doing this as a part-time thing, or is this something worth citing? And then the study itself, normally we don't have Wikipedia articles on studies, but this particular study is something that's revived every something like a 10-year cycle. It's continuously ongoing, but then there's major releases periodically, something like that. I would compare it to the report of the International Panel on Climate Change, something else similar. So they drop a 1,500-page report, maybe databases too, but they actually do put a 1,500-page report that they just drop and say, here's climate change, here's the state of climate change globally, periodically. And global burden disease, they have this database thing, and it's broken down in more pieces. But I would say that they're comparable. Both of those, the public needs access to this kind of information to understand the modern world. Both of them are inaccessible in different ways. Both of them have Wikipedia articles that I don't think fairly represent either the organization or the study that they're putting out, and also are undercited in Wikipedia for this lack of accessibility to the knowledge contained within the study.
So what kind of action would you like to see on those pages?
I would like to see every illustration independently curated and archived, so that Wikipedia could just scoop them all up, put them in our media archives, and begin the process of integrating them in Wikipedia articles, translating them, remixing them. I would like to see investment in third-party journalism and review. This doesn't have to be a national newspaper, maybe like graduate students who aren't paid to promote this organization or this study, just independently critique, not this organization, but what is many global health organizations. If anybody wants to be cited or discussed in the global health media ecosystem, we need to know who these organizations are, what's the quality of their information, to what extent are they reputable. Everybody has some kind of scandal, everybody has some kind of misstep. How should we judge that if there's some kind of problem section in the media that's going to be persistent? Did they work that out? Did that get resolved? It just happens. If you're operating on a scale large enough, then you're going to have some missteps. And how do you address the criticism in the journalism? If you're publishing about every country in the world, of course there's going to be some countries that complain. But how do we navigate that? And who do we talk to for an independent assessment of how that went down? Open access for the text, of course, that's a given. Open access for the data. We have a complement to Wikipedia called Wikidata, where we're increasingly seeking structured data and different information to put data in Wikipedia articles when we can interpret it appropriately. We've done this with COVID. So if you go to popular search engines and you search for different aspects of COVID, then popular search engines will have a window on the right that says, we got this data from Wikipedia. That's who they're crediting. So increasingly Wikipedia is getting credit instead of organizations. And the reason why the tech companies are pulling their content from Wikipedia, it's because Wikipedia, it's not that we want to make a standard or be the uniform way of publishing things. It's just that we're so darn accessible. it's so easy to export data or content from Wikipedia. Whereas if somebody wanted to scrape data from the global burden of disease study or some other database, then yes, an informaticist can go in and pull data from anywhere, but there is a bit of a learning curve per website to understand what kind of data you're pulling out. What are the labels on the data? It means one person per one website. Generally, that's the norm. Whereas if you have an informaticist go into Wikidata, then you can pull out health information and population and biographies and anything that Wikipedia covers. You can pull out a huge multilingual data set for it. And you only need to learn how to access that one database rather than navigating to every website in the world for a bespoke solution to accessing data. So that's why increasingly so many organizations are pulling their data out of Wikidata. There's a lot of precision lost. We're not trying to mirror every huge data set. We want curated data sets. I don't want to talk so much about Wikidata. We can meet another time and talk about Wikidata if you like. But Wikidata is not attempting to mirror every data set in the world. We only want the data that we think should go in front of human eyes for discussion. So if it's data that needs to be interpreted by a machine, we really don't want to host that in Wikidata. But if it's data that we think two humans would actually talk about and have a conversation about, that's what we want to put in Wikidata, because that's what we could conceivably represent in Wikipedia articles or use to make infographics or data visualizations, or that other organizations like search engines could serve people in response to a fact like how many people in my community have COVID, how many people in my state have COVID. That's the kind of thing that we would host in Wikipedia, or for any other disease if that information existed and were accessible. So that's what I want in Wikipedia. The other thing I'd want, just a relationship, please. If I know there's a communication department at this organization, can we have somebody at that organization commit like 20 hours a year? Can you get a college student? Just hire a college student for minimum wage, whatever the minimum wage of the university is.
Don't worry.
and just say, your job is to engage with Wikipedia and have ongoing conversations and build an ongoing relationship with Wikipedia. Can we do that? Is there any budget in the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who, thank you, they sponsored some of my activities. Thank you. They sponsored my first talk at the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation in 2011. They were the sponsors, so I did talk. So I thank you for sponsoring me 10 years ago and buying the chocolate that was distributed at that particular meeting. I still remember to this day. But could they sponsor a student to do something with this very important media communication channel in addition to your other outreach strategies? Let's do something more than zero. It doesn't have to be much.
From what you've shared, I guess what I'm still kind of confused about is your statement that we need to know how to judge these organizations and the work that they're producing in context of some of the scandals and pushback that they're inevitably going to receive. But there is a lot of journalism out there about IHME and the feathers that they've ruffled. So is it just a matter of editors not being aware of that or not caring, like you said, because it's really niche? But even if that's the answer, then I struggle with that, because as you pointed out earlier, this study is so huge that it could be like a single source of information for a lot of different Wikipedia articles. So surely the organization producing it would warrant a lot of attention.
In Wikipedia, we have ways of grading how important articles are. And the article for the Global Burden of Disease study is not very important, according to Wikipedia's grading system. And the article for the organization is not very important, according to Wikipedia's grading system. Some of the reasons why it's not important is because it's low traffic. That is, people are not searching for this article, they're not going to it. It's also low links. That is, there's not a lot of other Wikipedia articles pointing to this. So you can have a low traffic article that's highly linked and it's still important. Or you could have a high traffic article that doesn't have any links and it could be important also. Something else that could make an article important is if it has a fan base. So you have some very insignificant Wikipedia articles that just have a niche fan base that do a lot to curate that article. So if somebody will actually volunteer their labor, that can make something important as well. we're not looking for corporate chills to make up for a fan base, but if there's an organic community around something, then it could be important. So why I don't think that these various publications are cited is because the global burden of disease study is not well cited in Wikipedia. And the reason why it's not well cited is because it's so inaccessible for so many reasons. If we could actually cite this study in Wikipedia at scale, that is the Wikipedia article for every country, the Wikipedia article for every disease, and then translate that into 300 languages, this study could potentially be one of the most cited studies in Wikipedia. And we don't need to, we'll have to work it away because this is an unusual study. It comes in many pieces. It has many papers from it. It gets revised over the years. And we don't necessarily, we'll have to talk about this because this is a new mode of research. And we don't necessarily need to drive the traffic to one particular paper. There's something overarching about the study where if somebody, when we make a citation, we don't say, here's the 20-year repository of everything that has happened here. That's, you know, this organization and the pseudo organization before it got legally established. And, you know, there's many papers out of this study. So somehow we need to have some kind of hub and figure out what are we gonna, if we were to cite this paper in thousands or tens of thousands of places in the Wikipedia ecosystem, then what are the common elements of a citation? So this would be, we're gonna have to rethink the citation a bit because what is the banner under which we're gonna organize this? Is the banner that we're gonna organize this under global burden of disease study, or would it, for example, be global burden of disease study for a given year, the latest iteration of it? Or do we link to particular papers so that people immediately find it? But if they immediately find what they're looking for, that doesn't give them context about the research project as a whole and its unified structure and unified quality control and attempt at global scope. So we just need to talk this through, have some editorial control. So if it were the case that a lot of people in Wikipedia were citing this, then suddenly we need to know who this organization is, who's behind it, and tell us some more about the administrative structure. Who are their partners? Not just about the organization, who are their funders? Like, do they have corporate funders who have an agenda in this? Like, who are they connected to? Who are their people? Who are their people? And we have ways of bringing this up in Wikipedia, but no citations. We don't need to know the study.
Okay.
We don't know
That's
the study.
really good
Why should we need to know the organization?
Right. That's why I was so confused when I saw your edit reversion that they didn't need to know all of the funders, because to me it's a really important kind of accountability structure that you have to know, as well as the staff, to understand their backgrounds and how their previous experiences or connections to corporations, perhaps, especially in global health, would influence the information that they're producing. So that definitely explains a lot. Thank you.
We don't need to know what they say about their funders. We need to know what their worst enemies and critics say about their funders. Like, what's the worst thing you can say? Have they ever looked the other way when a vaccine went wrong? You know, we want to hear from their critics. So, like, seriously, put it on the table and see what honestly is going right and what's going wrong out in the open with fair and open conversation, and not have it in control of a marketing or public relations professional. You know, that's not who we want to have the last word. And it's not that we're looking for bad things about people. It's just that we want to build trust and transparency and legitimacy. And you can't get that if the last word is from a public relations agency that you've hired to make you look good. That's not an honest person to get the story from.
There was also a paid editing scandal, if I can call it that was associated with some of these pages.
Yeah.
This is known on.
Let's not talk about it. I know what you're talking about. Let's just talk about this in general terms without naming names.
Okay,
you
sure.
can tell me everything about it, but I'm aware of the one you're talking about. We could talk names, but I think it's just kind of a distraction. Yeah.
Sure. Well, I'm really interested about, I guess it's two things. First, why an altruistic paid editing situation that's fully disclosed on Wikipedia could be problematic. Mm-hmm. And specifically how that kind of the problems associated with that content creation could perhaps be compounded when we're talking about healthcare information.
There has never been a There is no example in the past 20 years in the entire Wikipedia platform of any communication organization having a good relationship with the Wikipedia community. So Wikipedia community lays out a certain number of rules and said, let's negotiate. There's been many PR agencies and many communications agencies. The answer to your question is the organization was not in compliance, and it's completely obvious to somebody who is attuned to Wikipedia community culture. So violation, violation, violation. I know that this was a well-developed case and they made their presentation, but there were so many things that were out of step with Wikipedia community expectations that this had no chance of going forward until and unless they started to comply with Wikipedia community policy. So you picked one particular case. I'll give you the insight that that's exactly like so many other cases. I don't see anything special about this case, except that maybe they tried to do a bit more engagement in Wikipedia, but it was sunk from the beginning, because what they needed to start from was disclosure to the Wikipedia community in the way that Wiki community requests, transparency about what they're editing, who's editing, where are they getting their sources, some conversation about what they can and can't say. Are they being directed to not say things? What's their protocol for producing this editorial content? What biases may they have? It's just, if they're not going to start with transparency, the Wikipedia community doesn't want this. Some people may say, wouldn't it be better if there were more paid organizations in Wikipedia? Wouldn't you be getting some expert content? We just don't want to compromise on the trust. Wikipedia has a reputation for writing the rules which advocate for our volunteers, our reviewers, our readers. And if somebody wants us to compromise on those, and that's how they say that they want to begin a relationship with us, at best, we'll have the conversation to say, why do you think we should throw out our ethics, and hear what they have to say? But if they just say, we need to throw out your ethics, and I don't want to talk about that right now, and it's really important that you let us do what we want to do, we're not ready to do that. And that's what's happened in this case, and that's what happened in so many other cases. We need somebody to talk to us, frankly, peer to peer. And that has to happen if an institution wants to have a relationship. I'll say something else. I'm paid by a university. I'm something called a Wikipedian in residence.
Right.
I've watched. I've outlived them all. I've watched all my peers and colleagues fail and do something promotional, and I've outlived them all. They're all gone now. There's some people who are standing. So I got paid to edit Wikipedia in 2006. I was employed by a church, not to edit about the church, but to edit about to help people edit about religion in general. And I didn't realize it at the time because these conversations weren't in place in 2006. But that's the way that Wikipedia was supposed to work. It was just my instinct at the time, and that was a pretty good start for me. And then in 2008, I was at an organization. I started editing about Wikipedia. I never edited about the organization. I didn't edit about the research project. I was editing about the field of our research. And as it turns out, that was the thing to do. And then I got another Wikipedia job in 2012, full-time. I was the first person to get a full-time job editing Wikipedia with a very understanding organization that let me edit in their expertise. I hardly even talked with anyone else at the organization about what I should edit. It was less about Lane editing for the organization. It was more like they dropped Lane into the archives and said Lane can do whatever he wants.
Pretty ideal position.
It was an ideal position. And that's unusual. I know not every nonprofit organization can do that. This was an organization with a huge archive of knowledge. Wow. that could be represented in Wikipedia. But there is one kind of organization that really can do that. And I highly recommend that they are Wikipedians, and that's universities. I can go in any department in my university, and there's knowledge that ought to be represented in Wikipedia. And there's students there that are willing to add that content that they're learning in class to Wikipedia, and it's fun for them. I think every university should hire a Wikipedian, because good for knowledge distribution, good for the students as a social activity, good for the organization to come up with its media planning, like how can they make their archives and library resources and knowledge and research papers more accessible. And also, increasingly, Wikipedia itself is a source of knowledge. So I'm in a school of data science, And no matter what the students are researching, if they want to pull information out about Wikipedia, if they need general reference information about something, then what do you know? Wikipedia's got a lot of it. It's actually the mother lode of general reference information, and it can be used for research without giving back to Wikipedia. I mean, of course somebody can, but it's useful in itself. So it's so hard for organizations to have a Wikipedian on staff and then resist the temptation. So say, okay, you've been here for 3 months. Where's the biography of our senior executives? Yeah. All right, can you, I know they were involved in sex scandals, but can you please remove those? And, you know, it's very important that you put where their children went to school in the article. That's urgent. And this is what we're paying you to do. So many times organizations have good intentions in hiring a Wikipedian, and a Wikipedian comes there, and then behind the scenes, they say, oh my God, my day's come. Yeah. They want me to make an article for the executive's kid. What do I do?
Yeah. Those were really the main, I've heard all of my main questions. I mean, I can ask a few more about like notability and the neutral point of view policy.
You want to meet again another time?
Yeah, or do that.
Happy to talk about any aspect of Wikipedia.
How many of these calls have you done? If you had to estimate.
I've given maybe 1,000 Wikipedia talks in front of an audience, more than anybody else in the world, I suppose. These talks with journalists, usually shorter, usually more on point, less broad, usually about one particular issue. But you've asked some general interest questions, and I know when people ask me, can you answer this one question? I wish that I could give them some broader context. And if you're interested in, I'm not doing this for Wikipedia. I know we've been talking about Wikipedia. I don't care about Wikipedia. And in general, Wikipedia editors don't care about Wikipedia. I care about public access to good information. The only reason I'm in Wikipedia is because Wikipedia is the bucket into which it's easy to pour this stuff. But what I really want is for all this information to be accessible in every communication channel. Wikipedia is just the channel or the venue, the avenue by means of which we're doing this nowadays. But Wikipedia could go obsolete for whatever reason. The content within Wikipedia will never go obsolete. If we open this is the content that humanity is going to carry forth for as long as the internet and digital media persist in archives. We're building that right now. So we want to open the archives of knowledge for humanity. And I appreciate that you're asking about how can health organizations actually achieve communication impact? What's the bigger picture beyond the health organization, beyond Wikipedia? How do you get this knowledge to circulate freely in all communication channels? And that's what I'm interested in talking about. And I appreciate these kind of questions that you're asking that take examples from Wikipedia, but I know you have a broader goal. How do we give people access to this information in a way that they can understand it? That's what I'd be happy to talk with you about.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. I've gotten a lot of really useful information. I mean, it's just so much context that, like, regardless of how many pages on Wikipedia I've stalked, it's a lot to wrap my head around.